Good evening and welcome on a dark and stormy night. I call to order the December 18th, 2014 meeting of the City of Bellingham Planning Commission and ask that everybody silence their electronic devices because I don't want to hear whirring and stuff when we're talking. Heather, would you please call the roll?
Tom Grinstad.
Here.
Jeff Brown. Here. Garrett O'Brien.
Here.
Holly Taishi.
Here.
Phyllis McKee. Here. Steve Crooks.
Here.
Cerise Noah. Here.
Next on the agenda is approval of previous meeting minutes, which we don't have. Further down the line is the public comment period. And this is the time that we allow the public to come talk to the Planning Commission about anything their heart desires, except for the subject of tonight's meeting, which is the sneak preview at the City of Bellingham's subdivision ordinance. So if you want to talk about tofu, turkey, or anything else, 3 minutes to amaze the world.
Hi, my name is David Cunningham. I live in the Birchwood neighborhood, and I wasn't really planning on talking. I just thought I'd come in and watch tonight. But it occurred to me that one of the things that we have in our neighborhood quite a lot of illegal second units on the lots, and partly because we have large lots in the neighborhood. And one of the things we have one across the street from us, and several of us have sent complaints to the city about the illegal unit. The city knows about it. And one of my biggest concerns is the lack of enforcement. You guys work really hard at making sure that we have planning done in a way that will make the city a better place. But one of the problems I see is that if we don't have enforcement of the ordinances that we create, then there's really not a whole lot of sense in having the ordinances. So I just want to say that whatever you guys do, anything you can build into it so that there's some good enforcement of the rules that you create will really improve the city a lot. And it's one of the things I think sometimes is lacking in our community. Thank you.
Do you have any suggestions, David?
I wish I did.
Yeah. Thank you.
So Mike McCauley, 2627 Sunset Drive, and I have my official Port Commissioner hat on tonight, and I hope that I'm not speaking to the subdivision ordinance. I ran into Phyllis at our last meeting on Tuesday, and she asked that I might come and say a few words about airport growth in regards to what you folks are talking about. And one of the things that we are hearing a lot, and we actually formed a new committee to deal with, is our airport growth issue and how it relates to community desires and community concerns. And one of those concerns is noise. Now, if you look north toward the northeast of Ferndale, northeast of Bellingham, east of Ferndale, you'll see a lot of new houses going in along Slater Road, and that really concerns me because we're having a terrible time trying to manage the issue of airport noise. Airports are noisy, and when I look at some of the growth projections for Bellingham and where it's going to grow, I'm seeing a lot of housing suggested for parts into the north end around the airport, and so of course that is concerning. We don't want to keep people out, but I also do want to let you know that there are some conflicts there that could be avoided if we take a very careful look on how we grow and where we grow. So I just want to bring that up to your attention, and so we have some airport staff that would love to talk to you guys more. Of course, I can talk to you more, and then also we have the Bellingham International Airport Advisory Committee, the BIAC, which is a great resource as well. So if we can be of any assistance at all in helping you folks, then just let us know. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Hello, good evening. My name is Clayton Petrie, and I wanted to come talk to you a little bit about the Burke Trends study that was brought up at the hearing a few weeks ago. And first off, I just want to say Of course, there will continue to be high demand for all housing types here, including, but certainly not exclusively, multifamily housing. So I read the Burke report again, and it talks about how there's all kinds of demand, and we're short of all kinds of housing in Bellingham. I think that's well known. We have abnormally low vacancy rate, and we have the officially declared affordable housing emergency. You might want to look at this chart here to see where we rank compared to other similar counties. And Bellingham, of course, is a big part of that. You know, basically it means newcomers here have to scurry like hamsters to a shoebox, finding whatever place they can to live in, if they insist on living in Bellingham proper. I couldn't find a place in the report that supports a mix of one single-family home for every 5 multifamily homes. There's no data in there that really suggests that sort of housing mix. But I think if you look at the graphs and charts in the report, in that trends report, you'll see that you need a much more reasoned, balanced supply of home types than you have currently. Or that would happen if you increased the housing supply merely by adding more multifamily planning. If you look at page 15 in that report, which you guys already have, I don't know if you have it with you, but it talks about senior housing preferences. That's the one that it says is going to surge for about the next decade. That's the older people, and it says, you know, quote, they showed a strong preference for single-family home ownership, accounting for 71%. It's not the whole sentence, but you know, you can go back and find it in there. It spends a lot of time analyzing the effect of foreign investment, foreign-born immigration has on Whatcom County and Bellingham, but when they tally up the migration in Appendix A, it completely ignores this large, significant number of people that affect our housing and commercial supply. As the report tells us, migration is one of the key components of population change in a community, and I don't see very much of that in this in the analysis, as opposed in the appendix where the data is in the back. You know, their immigrant households were 30% of overall household growth. They expect it to grow with the economy as it makes a comeback. Foreign-born immigrants currently make up 10% of the Bellingham community. And clearly, that migration is not only through the counties and states, but the charts do attribute 100% of migration to interstate migration. And even if that is only interstate migration that they're talking about, which it doesn't look like it is, where's the immigrant information? You know, the foreign demographic may not fit into what you expect either. They don't desire the supply of housing that we have at all, despite often being pointed out as the demographic that may be more accepting of that kind of thing. They're 11.4% of county population, 10.2% of city, 59% of them are white, 28% are Asian. Their household size is under 3, average family size is slightly over. 47% own their own home, and 73.3% spend less than 30% of their income on that home. So they can really afford these places. The bottom line is that Bellingham has a serious shortage of housing of all types. The shortage has led us down a path of unaffordability worse than that of Seattle and King County, and it's destroyed our success in attracting over 60% of all the newcomers into Bellingham. The report cited to you in no way supports the housing mix we have, or a housing mix with even more multifamily housing, but it does give data and support for increasing single-family housing supply somewhere between half and 3/4 of the supply, in my opinion. I highly, highly encourage you to look at this problem as the paramount issue for the comprehensive plan update. And then I have a little bit more stuff, but it's all in the text. So, thank you.
Thank you, Clayton. Anyone else wish to address the commission? Okay, we'll close that part of the meeting. And now we get down to the real meat and potatoes, or something. Kathy?
are you going to introduce the item, or would you like me to do that?
This is your item.
Perfect. So this is a public hearing to consider the update of the Title 18 of the Bellingham Municipal Code, otherwise known as the subdivision ordinance. This is the first meeting hearing in what is anticipated to have at least one more, if not many more. As we all know, the Planning Commission is the first step. City Council makes the final decision. What I would like to do this evening, along with other staff members present, which is Kurt Nabefeld and Greg Ockett, is we would like to give an overview, somewhat, this is Subdivision 101, as to the history and the background of subdivisions, not only as they originally occurred as settlement came, but how that relates to Washington State, and then more importantly, how it relates to the city of Bellingham, and then go into the specifics into the subdivision ordinance, and then talk a little bit about the public outreach that has occurred to date, some challenges with the subdivision ordinance that have been identified not only through those public outreach opportunities, but also from staff's opinion or experience, and then most importantly, to discuss the opportunities. And that's really why we're here tonight, is to discuss those opportunities and for the Planning Commission to give us direction as we move forward to really look at the specifics as to how we should look into amending the subdivision ordinance. And I received a phone call from one of the representatives of the Birchwood neighborhood, and she says, I don't understand the staff report because there's no specific recommendations in there. What is staff proposing? And I said, staff isn't proposing anything at this point. What we're doing is we are seeking guidance. And with that guidance, we will then go to more public outreach and then start to bring forward some specific changes. But we don't want to do that without direction, and staff doesn't want to do that without more public involvement. So this truly is an introduction, and hopefully you find it beneficial as you move forward in your review. So this is generally what I just talked about, but there's going to be some, these are kind of the components of the presentation. So we're going to talk about the history, we're going to talk about 18 and its specificities, the challenges. I want to go through a little bit what our public outreach was, why we chose what we did, and already I'm seeing successes from that, and I'll get to that when I get there, opportunities, and most importantly, the next steps. So land division started actually with the settlement of America, and you wonder, well, why do we go back that far? Land divisions at the time were done by the government or by the motherland, and they separated land into, similar to what we see today, tracts for ownership, public spaces. They developed roads. It's much of what shaped what we have here today. What they found during the settlement time is when the government offered these lands for ownership, there was a lot of the private ownerships then further subdivided the properties, and there became an abundance. There became an oversupply. And there was a public reaction to that. And the public reaction is they identified that there was an importance or a need to some sort of regulation to the subdivision of land. There were lands being created without infrastructure. There were lands being created that didn't have access. There were lands that were not buildable. And people who were purchasing these lands were not happy. They needed something. They thought they were getting something that they weren't getting. So in the 1700s, the government decided to change this, and they offered it up for private developers, and they actually sold chunks of land to private developers to see yet if they could do a better job. And not learning from their previous, they did not do a better job. And again, there was, over the next century, a rapid growth of subdivisions. But what we saw during that time, as much as what we see here today, we have grid patterns. They had grid patterns, which is similar to what we have here today. But unfortunately, there was no relation to the landscape. And again, there were no physical improvements. And once again, the Americans started to realize the dangers of uncontrolled development. So while all this was going on the East Coast and the West Coast, in the Washington and Oregon territories, came the Donation Claim Line Act. And this truly, at least in Bellingham, and I will show you a slide in a minute, was when the first subdivisions of Bellingham actually occurred. And the interesting thing about these donation claims is that you could acquire these lands at no cost. And once again, you can see here, because of accessibility to the lands, the donation claim lines are found on the edge of the area or the water. And for those of you who have gone through any maps or old historical information in the city of Bellingham, you'll see that there's these notation to these donation claim lines. And this is what happened, and they were all named after the people who did it. Some of them obviously are more well known than others: Peabody, Utter, Roeder. So they were some of our founding fathers. Within those donation claim lines, you will see that there were some early subdivisions that were very common to what was occurring on the East Coast. We had 80 to 100-foot rights-of-way. You wonder why so large. Well, there were a lot of different means then of transportation. It wasn't just the automobile who needed, 8 to 10 feet to travel. We saw lots that were platted at 25 by 100s or 50 by 100s, which I think you'll find common to much of our older platted lots. Columbia neighborhood, Letter Streets neighborhood, much of South Hill neighborhood, and they had much of a grid pattern. And these are some of our older first subdivisions, and you can see the grid pattern, you can see the wide right-of-ways, but the thing that's interesting about this is you don't see any topography, and these are very steep. So some of these lands still today are not developed. They do not have roads that lead to these lots. So once again, as the donation claims came, people began to subdivide. Once again, there was a public reaction because there was too much uncontrolled growth. My daughter can play that on the piano. I love it, actually. So there's two eras now I want to talk about. One is pre-World War II, and the other is post-World War II. Sorry, I don't want to go right there. And again, in reaction to all this uncontrolled growth, there was an act that was passed called the Standard City Planning Enabling Act, which, quite honestly, I didn't know that's what it was called at the time. But what this did is it gave states authority for the first time to control and regulate land division. And again, this was in response to the public outcries that have continued and continued over the centuries. Many states did not take the opportunity and did not enable any legislation to control. Once again, there was a public reaction to that. Post-World War II, I think we all are fairly familiar with the suburban growth and the reactions that came from that. It grew further and further and further away from the central core where all the services were located. So again, in response to that, the state of Washington actually did pass the laws of 1937, which was the Washington state first subdivision regulations. And what that did is it gave local municipalities the opportunity to pass subdivision regulations. Many did not. And and then proceeding from that, we got the laws of, and they looked like this. So generally speaking, what we had are some very minimal regulations for subdivisions. And in 1969, these were repealed in their entirety, and they were adopted by now what we have, which is 5817 in the RCWs, and it's that chapter. And there's differences in those regulations of 5816 versus what we have today of 5817. And a lot of them dealt with, the newer regulations really deal with going into more specificity, providing more opportunity and more regulations so that the local municipalities can actually regulate subdivisions. Again, out of response to uncontrolled growth and public reactions. So Bellingham adopted their first subdivision ordinance in 1964, and that was in response to the state's enactment. And as you can see, from 1937, we didn't adopt them until 1964. So there was some period of time. And for the first time, the city regulated subdivision ordinance. While the regulations were minimal, they still did provide the requirement for recording. They did provide for some decisions by the Planning Commission, so there was some process that was initiated with that. But interestingly enough, similar to the other public outcries, there were still no requirements for infrastructure. There were no requirements for public spaces or anything of that nature. So the city of Bellingham in 1965 and 1967, in a response to that, amended the ordinance, and in 1965 required public sewer, and in 1967 required public streets. So what that means is that before you establish the lots and create the lots, you have to provide these public amenities. And the thing that's interesting about that, these are what the subdivisions look like. So this is the plat of Highland Heights, and then the next thing you'll see is the plat of Highland Heights number 2, or Division 2. So what we started to see are plats being phased, because they now had the obligation to put in public infrastructure. So the larger the land, the less likely it was that they were going to put in all the public infrastructure to serve all lots at one time. And we started to see phasing. So what I've done here is I've highlighted, just for example, Highland Heights, because that was the example that I showed you, and it took them 5 phases to complete the phase. So going back to early times in Bellingham and or settlement, this was requiring certain public infrastructure to be in place before the lots became available. Obviously, this didn't happen in all the subdivisions because some of the subdivisions were already recorded and they were already created due to the previous subdivision acts. So in response to the state's adoption of RCW 5817 in 1969, Bellingham further modified their subdivision regulations in 1971. And most of what you find in the regulations of the state's 1969 rules are fairly in effect today, and they've had 2 major updates since. In 1973, the city amended those regulations to include lot line adjustments, clusters, and actually some lot design standards at that time. And then in 1997, we have what we have today, and we're still with it today. So as you can see, we're into these subdivision regulations for almost 20 years. So specifically, let's talk a little bit about Title 18. Title 18 was attached to your staff report as Exhibit E. And the purpose for giving that to you today is because we want you to become familiar with that. A lot of what we bring forward to you in the future will show how it is different than that Exhibit E. So if you could bring that to every meeting. No, if you could at least try to bring that in context, that would be most helpful, because it will be a document we refer to in the future. And yes, Tom, there will be a test at some point. So the subdivision ordinance, like the state regulations and like the previous versions of the subdivision ordinance, are broken into certain chapters. And similar to other municipalities, there's a lot line adjustment section, a short plat, a preliminary plat. It goes through all these subdivision types, and it gives some specificity about each of those. And what I want to do is briefly go over what some of those subdivision types are. So one of the simplest, at times, subdivision process that we have is what's called a lot line adjustment. Some call them boundary line adjustments. City of Bellingham has adopted a lot line adjustment as a name. Things interesting about a lot line adjustment is the state actually does not regulate lot line adjustments. It leaves it up to the local municipalities how they will regulate them. And we have chosen to process a lot line adjustment essentially similar, very similar to that of what we do short plats. So we do require Mylars to be recorded, and at the auditor's office for a permanent form of for a permanent record. So basically, what I want to show you here on the front sheet is this. Basically, there's some acknowledgments. There's a declaration, meaning the landowners are required to acknowledge that they are going through this lot line adjustment. And the City of Bellingham verifies that who is signing the lot line adjustment or any subdivision actually has the legal authority as a vested owner to do that. It includes a legal description and then acknowledgement from the city as to meeting codes and regulations. What also accompanies this is a map. And what you can see here is there's some surveying done. It shows the property lines. It shows any existing structures. But more importantly, what I want to show you is what a lot line adjustment does. Is you can see the reference here of the old lot line and the new lot line. And so what this was is prior to the lot line adjustment, this is where the lot line was. And what they did is they moved the lot line adjustment to here. And now it follows this line. There's many reasons people choose to do lot line adjustments. This one, there happens to be a retaining wall, and it was a mutual agreement between property owners to move the property line to fit some existing infrastructure. Some of them are over to settle land disputes. They could be far, and I mean, there's so many different reasons. The next is a short plat. And you'll see there's a lot of acknowledgments on a short plat similar to a lot line adjustment, and that will be a common theme throughout. But most importantly, what I want to show you is the land division. So prior to the short plat, this piece of property consisted of one piece. And in looking through the zoning and in looking through the density requirements, they had enough to create 2 lots. So what they did is they drew a property line here, and that established this as a new lot. So a lot line adjustment, you start with an X amount of lots, you end with an X amount of lots. With a short plat, you're creating additional lots. That's the main difference between those two. And what I want to show you next, because it's not, I couldn't get the graphics to show very well on the PowerPoint, is a final plat. So once again, you're going to see similarities to what we saw at the short plat and lot line adjustment. The thing that's most curious or most interesting about this is that not only is there a declaration of ownership that they're doing this to their free consent, but often with subdivisions, there's also a declaration of dedication, which means that they are actually giving the public something, and that something is usually rights of way. And in more times than not, subdivisions include the dedications of right-of-ways or new roads. There can be other dedications as well, utility easements, sometimes parks and open space, sometimes private open space, but those would obviously be given to the private. And what this shows, just by relation, and the reason I chose this is because it shows two subdivisions on one map. And the thing that's really interesting about this one is, I can't show you with the mouse because it's not there. What this doesn't show in specificity is that this right here is a trail easement that comes up and comes through, and then as a condition of this plat, we were able to extend St. Clair as a trail up to the railroad trail. So through a subdivision, we're able to look at a lot of different components and a lot of different pieces and really try to get the best fit for the land and what the needs are. We didn't believe that the extension of St. Clair made sense to a trail when we knew the road would never cross the trail. So instead, we didn't require them to build the road. We allowed them to build a trail in lieu of that, and that obviously provided much more public benefit. The other thing that you see here is that down in this area and down in this area, we're starting to consolidate open space. In this particular case, that open space happened to be critical areas or wetlands. And there's another subdivision that's down in this area called New Haven, and through this whole area, we were able to consolidate enough open space, and we actually received the governor's award for this project. So there's a little bit of relevance to me showing you that. One of the things that I'm not going to show you this evening is a preliminary plat. And the reason is a preliminary plat, it's a map, but it's a sketch. It is a best guess of what the final plat, which is what I just showed you, is going to look like. But what comes with a preliminary plat is a set of conditions, which says that prior to filing the plat, similar to what we talked about before, you're going to have to improve streets, you're going to have to put in sewer, you're going to have to put in water, and you're going to have to do all these things. So it's a lot more cumbersome to show you a preliminary plat because it's a land use approval that contains a lot of conditions. Where these are pretty pictures that I can show you. Binding site plans. The binding site plans are an alternative form of subdivision in state law, and the City of Bellingham has chosen to adopt the binding site plan process for only commercial and industrial uses. There is an option under state law to do that for residential, but at the time that the city adopted the binding site plans, we opted not to adopt the residential uses in binding site plans. So again, you're going to find a common theme of all the acknowledgments that come with most any subdivision. But the other thing that's interesting about a general binding site plan is it's a survey. It identifies a boundary. And what comes with a general binding site plan are, again, sets of regulations, development standards, land use regulations. I'm not showing you those because they're actually like in a permit form. But what they also have the option of doing in a binding site plan is what's called a specific binding site plan. And a specific binding site plan is part of the general binding site plan process when you start to carve off specific lots. So you're going to see that these next build off of each other. So you start with the survey as a whole, and now you have a specific binding site plan for 2 lots. And then they did subsequent binding site plans, and what they ended up with were this many lots. So originally they started out with 2 lots, and then they further subdivided those with subsequent binding site plans to create additional lots. There's a lot more flexibility in a binding site plan process, the way that the city of Bellingham's adopted its regulations, as opposed to coming in and doing, say, a 6 or 7 lot short plat for this industrial use. It helps if I push the right button. Any questions yet? I mean, I do this every single day, so I know I'm cruising through this. I mean, and this is really in hopes to try to help you understand what you're going to be asked to do. And what we're trying to do is lay out the very basic fundamentals of what a subdivision is, why it came to be what it is, and then what they are. And so at any time you can ask questions, but I'm just wondering, this is kind of a good break, if there's any questions about what you have heard today so far.
I have a stupid Norwegian question. In that specific binding site plan, I assume that there, in the process, there's something that will ensure that you don't end up with a landlocked piece of property. Is that correct?
And we do, and one of the things that's enticing to many about the binding site plans is that you are allowed to do access easements. And so those are some of the things we work through, and we ensure to achieve that all lots will have access.
Okay.
And as opposed to a subdivision where you'd be required to dedicate right-of-way, the binding site plan gives you the opportunity to do easements. So yes. Some of the other components of Title 18 include lots and blocks, infrastructure improvements, and process. Yeah? Oh.
So the binding site plans only can be used for industrial or commercial properties?
Correct.
What's the historical reasoning, why isn't binding site plans available for residential applications?
I think in part we felt because we had the subdivision process, and Bellingham at the time, and still somewhat today, has the thought that any fee simple parcel that is created should have full access to public infrastructure, sewer, water, and street. The street is probably one of the biggest components, one of the biggest differences of what you find in a binding site plan versus a conventional subdivision. We certainly do have examples in the city of Bellingham, and all of those have been annexed from the county. So they're all in the north end of the city because the county does allow residential in their binding site plan process. So we are familiar with those. We have seen success. So those are some of the topics we're certainly going to discuss, hopefully, as we move forward.
Could you do a multifamily residential development on a binding site plan parcel if the zoning was commercial, say, because a lot of our commercial zones permit apartments? Have we ever done that?
That's a discussion that we can talk about later.
Okay. Trick question.
It is a trick question. Yes, those will be discussions as we move through the process that I hope we discuss in detail. So please don't lose those thoughts. So what the lots and blocks do is that's kind of the bulk of what a subdivision is. Those are the parameters that establish what a lot's going to look like. Those are the parameters that establish what a street's going to look like. That's what tells you what your minimum lot size is going to be, in that whether you can deviate from the zoning's minimum lot size or if you have to maintain it. It's going to tell you what your street frontage requirements are. It really, truly is what shapes all of those pretty pictures that you saw. The process, much of the process has been removed and has been put into a different chapter or title into the Bellingham Municipal Code, but there still are some procedures in the subdivision ordinance. The infrastructure improvements, There are some areas within Title 18 that specifically state what standards there are. There's others that have reference to very old ordinances. But predominantly the requirements are for a lot line adjustment, and this goes for sewer, water, and street. For a lot line adjustment, if the lots abut prior to the lot line adjustment, the lots have to abut after the lot line adjustment. If the lots don't abut, you can still adjust the lots, and they don't have to butt at the end because we get those improvements with building permit. With a short plat, what we've said, if you're going to create new lots and with subdivisions, before you create those lots, those are the amendments that happened in the 60s, you will provide that public infrastructure. So oftentimes, if there's a short plat that doesn't abut sewer, water, and or street, then the developers are putting those infrastructure requirements in before they're actually able to have those lots for sale to develop upon. And that's what the infrastructure improvement section talks about. And it talks a little bit about stormwater. But as you can imagine, in 97, their stormwater regulations were a little different then than they are today. So there's not a whole lot on that. So one of the short plats I want to talk about are what we call pipe stem lots. Some people call them panhandles, some people call them flag lots. City of Bellingham, we call them pipe stem lots. And why do we call them pipe stems? Not really sure, actually, because it does look more like panhandle and it does look more like a flag. But the pipe stem portion of this lot 2 is this. Pipe stem is intended to give a lot legal frontage on sewer, water, and street. That is its primary function. The area of the pipe stem currently does not count towards meeting the overall density requirement of this lot. And just some other examples real quick. Here's your street. Here are 2 side-by-side pipe stems, which are permitted to have. And what we do through our regulations is we require the access to be consolidated into a single driveway. So there is one driveway that serves both these homes, and then there is an access easement that's provided with a recording of the short plat. This is one of my favorite short plats actually in the city of Bellingham, because if you drive to the end of Mackenzie Avenue and you look at the development, you would never know that the lot design looks as crazy as it does. And I should have put an aerial photo up, but I didn't. But what this shows, which we will be using in future conversations, is just how much regulation it takes and how much land street frontage actually consumes of a lot. Okay, so now I'm going to move into sort of the bulk of where we hope to go next. Questions again? Yes.
So I'm just trying to cement things. On your last slide, where you showed that division with all those pipe stems, and of course the purpose for the pipe stems is egress, and what I'm wondering is when you have easements, so you have a common driveway serving multiple properties, which would be common in the county. And then you have this process where each lot has its designated access instead of having an easement for a private road. How do you look at how you would divide a particular parcel with respect to those 2 options? Does it automatically require a pipe stem no matter what, even if you have 4 driveways right next to each other, or is it a flexibility to have a private road within your existing regulations?
There's no flexibility at this point. They're all prescriptive. So what we do is the standard code starts out with a requirement for a pipe stem for 30 feet wide. And then under certain circumstances, actually everywhere except for the Columbia and the Birchwood neighborhood, you can reduce that 30 feet to 20 feet for a single pipe stem. When you start, these are older subdivisions, when you start to have multiple side-by-sides, you can drop them down to 15 feet. So you can have 15-foot side-by-side pipe stems. But as you can imagine, once you get to 4, you're at 60 feet, which is a right-of-way. I mean, it's the same width as a right-of-way. The interesting thing about the one that I show you is that you come off of Mackenzie and it has this circular driveway that goes around like this, and then right smack in the middle is the most beautiful tree. So they took an opportunity and really made it work with really good design. So no, there is no flexibility in their current regulations. Every lot is required to have street frontage.
So was there a historical reason for that? And the thing I'm kind of interested in is a lot of the cities I've worked in doing routing, it's extraordinarily common to have a mix of private roads and public roads and all sorts of access, and not just newer cities, but older cities. And it's not necessarily cul-de-sacs, but there's a lot different development style, and I guess it looks to me like at some point a decision was made that the primacy of having direct access for each lot on a road took total precedence over having a different approach. And I'm just wondering if that was a conscious decision for certain reasons, or whether it just kind of slid that way, or if anyone knows.
I think it hasn't changed. I think that would be my best response for you. And doing a lot of research in other municipalities, many do require, many don't, some actually prohibit. So there's such a diversity out there, but I think what we can at least demonstrate in these types of situations is that the common driveways are working. And we're hopefully through, when we continue our discussions, that's going to be one of them. So, what are our challenges with the subdivision ordinance? This is meant to be a brief summary of the challenges. There are many. There are many also of how it interacts or relates to our other land use ordinances. But primarily is Title 18 lacks updates. We have not gone in and done any substantial substantive updates since its adoption in 1997. We've changed process, but we really haven't changed anything. So the other thing to keep in mind is from 1997 to the 60s and the 70s, there really wasn't a whole lot of change there either. One of the main things that we did in the late 90s when we adopted the current subdivision regulations is we actually we varied what the lot width requirement was based upon the zoning density. And that was primarily one of the biggest, and we allowed some flexibility in the pipe stem lots. But for the most part, everything has remained the same for a very long time. We also have some inconsistencies with state law. Our current regulations do not provide for a plat alteration process. They do not for either subdivisions or short subdivisions. We don't have a vacation provisions for plats for, again, either short plats or subdivisions. And there's some final plat procedures that we need to update into our regulations that I think have just been lost over the years and the times that we've done the updates. So there's some inconsistencies, and that has caused some issues. Obviously, the state law still prevails, but when the state law says you shall have these, it would be nice for us to have those. There are also some processes that are not clearly defined. Our final plat process contains the least detail of any provision that we have in the subdivision ordinance, and it actually is probably one of the most critical processes that we have in our subdivision ordinance. So we need to fix those things. The applicants need to understand what is expected of them just as exactly of what we are expecting of them. So there needs to be some reciprocation there. And Jeff, to kind of get back to what your comment was, we don't have a lot of performance-based regulations. They're black and white. They're like setbacks. This is what you will do. There's a little bit of flexibility in some lot sizes, but you got to have something and able to do that, and it's very limited. So we, staff, and our public outreach identified that there should be some performance-based measures in our subdivision ordinance, and one of the challenges in doing good subdivision is that we don't have those. And the other that I talked about is the lack of coordination with the other Bellingham municipal code sections. And we would like to see that more clearly defined. We feel it's necessary to have that more clearly defined. So, to date, what we have done is there have been two public outreach sessions that have occurred. One was not specifically related to the update of the subdivision ordinance, and that is what we call the Countywide Housing Affordable Task Force, or for short, CHAT. And what CHAT did is it initiated in 2008 to truly look at countywide some measures of providing affordable housing. And there were action items produced from that. And then what the city of Bellingham did in 2013 is we took portions of that group and we reconvened and we said, what can we do in Bellingham specifically? Let's not look generally at the county only. Let's also look at what we can do. And the chat identified some action items, and those are the 4 bullets. So they have recommended through this process that we look at lot size averaging, condo development in single-family zones, clustering in single-family zones, and some performance-based standards. So those are the recommendations that came out of CHAT that are specific to the subdivision process. What staff did in anticipation for this process is we did some public outreach and we identified some technical groups. And we organized 3 technical groups, each comprised of 4 members. And we looked at 3 topics. What's wrong with the existing processes? What works with the existing processes? Same with regulations. And then we had a group for forward thinking. What's out there that would be really beneficial to the community if we could do it here? What else is out there? And we met for an hour and a half to 2 hours. And I would say that that process is already working because we have members here who actually were part of those technical groups. And we have 2 planning commissioners, Garrett and Ali, who are also on those. And the information that staff received from that was invaluable. I mean, it's huge because they're the experts. They are our customers, and we needed to hear from them what was working, because we certainly don't want to change what's working, but more importantly, what do we need to focus on? And these are, there were many bullet points from these meetings that we had, but these were some of them, and they came up, they were common amongst all groups. The land we have left has challenges. It's got critical areas in terms of wetlands, it's steep, doesn't have infrastructure, some of it doesn't even have safe access by the fire department, meaning their response times. It's endless as to some of the challenges our vacant land has, and most of it is in the perimeter of the city, and that makes sense. The other thing that was interesting out of this, and it was something that staff, we thought, but then it was further reinforced with our group, infill development is different than greenfield development. What happens inside is should be regulated different, possibly, than what's happening on the outside. When you've got large tracts of vacant land, what you can possibly do on that land is really different than working in existing neighborhoods. So the greenfields along the perimeter versus the infill, and that was a common theme that came up, is let's explore whether they should be treated the same or whether they should be treated differently, and what are the regulations that will go with those. And again, we talked about performance-based standards. And kind of getting back to the infill versus greenfield is allowing increased land uses in those greenfield developments. You're creating new neighborhoods. You're not bringing something in necessarily to a new neighborhood. You're creating that new neighborhood. Or bringing something into an existing neighborhood. You're creating that new neighborhood. So let's open our opportunities and see how they work. And so that's kind of what's meant by that. And also allowing more administrative authority, which kind of goes back to prescriptive. A lot of our codes are prescriptive. While they may meet the intent, they may not meet the prescriptive code. So it's like, again, how can we look at that? I think the thing for me that was a success from these technical groups is they were not staff-led, they were member-led. We had a group, we had a list of probably 7, 8 questions that only prompted discussion. If there was a conversation that staff wanted to dig a little deeper into, we would prompt additional questions, but they were not led by us. So the information that came from those were all from the group members. So from those, and there's a lot here, but they are also in your packet, the staff has compiled the public outreach process. We've looked at our existing challenges and what we are putting forward and bringing to the Planning Commission right now are what we're calling process goals or action items. These are what we want you to provide direction to staff so that we can go through those next steps. And we have 8 process goals. And our intent here is to use these as agenda topics when we go through and as we go through the next round of public interaction. And we're the goal or the reason in doing this is that these are easy topics to totally get off track, and we want to be focused, and we want to be able to, provide limits of how we go through these. So I'll just read through them real quick. We want to establish standards that respond to the unique characteristics of the city's remaining vacant land and opportunities for development within existing neighborhoods. We want to establish performance-based regulations that provide alternative and innovative methods for land development. We want to establish a broader range of permitted housing types and land uses within preliminary plat approvals. Establish provisions that grant the director administrative authority to deviate from subdivision standards in certain defined circumstances. Establish criteria that determine when modifications to approved subdivisions constitute a new application. Currently, if there's an application and an applicant wants to change that, we struggle every time with, whoa, is it similar enough or is it so different? So we're trying to provide criteria so that if it doesn't have to go out through the public process, the public can at least be assured that if there are going to be deviations, these are the standards by which we'll establish those. So again, it's transparency for those to understand the process. Establish timelines for staff reviews associated with the final subdivision approval, which is some of what I've talked about. Establish provisions for those state subdivision rules that are not currently provided. And remove redundant development regulations from Title 18 that are regulated in other BMC sections. So we think that there's an opportunity here. We think that obviously one of the opportunities is bringing this into consistency with state law. There's value in at least exploring and identifying performance-based regulations. Linking this to the Bellingham Municipal Code will ensure that this is a very straightforward process, that there won't be something hidden in the subdivision ordinance that should be in the critical area ordinance or vice versa. So again, it's really trying to be transparent. And most importantly, we want to eliminate waste in the review process. We want to streamline this. We want everybody to know what's expected of each party. So we've identified some process objectives as well based upon the opportunities. So the first goals are really to relate to the challenges and how can we make the challenges, and then we want to also work on our opportunities. So we want to update the subdivision ordinance in compliance with the objectives of the comprehensive plan. Yes, it's true, we are going forward with an update to the comprehensive plan, and people may say, well, why are we doing this now when we're updating the comp plan? The comprehensive plan update is not an overhaul of the entire comp plan. What it is it's a this actually doing the subdivision review right now and adopting these regulations are consistent with this comprehensive plan update, so we can make sure that our subdivision regulations are going to be consistent with the comp plan. And we don't believe that much of the goals and policies of the current comp plan are going to change through the process, at least as they relate to subdivisions. So we believe that there's a lot of unanswered goals and policies in the comprehensive plan that we need to draw out and to put into our regulations. And that has not happened yet since the original adoption. So again, that's an opportunity. Compliance with state law. We've already talked about Bellingham Municipal Code. And we talked about the waste as well. One of the things that we are most certain, but we're not positive, is that amending the subdivision ordinance will probably necessitate other amendments to the Bellingham Municipal Code. And as we go through this process, we'll be able to better identify what those changes are. So this isn't only within Title 18, we believe. We think that there's going to be other processes or other titles and chapters that need to be amended as well. So with that, I leave it now to the public process. I leave it to questions. I truly think this is where we're at next. This will lead into my next my closing statement, which I do have an excerpt of a book I want to read, but I'll wait until we're done with that before you close the public hearing, please. But this is what the process needs to do. The process needs to bring people together. We need to fill in those bubbles, those balloons, and we need to all have a conversation. The community needs to own this subdivision ordinance. We just need to implement it. And the gentleman earlier said, don't create a regulation you can't enforce. 100%, that's our goal. A lot of the subdivision regulations, however, are easier to enforce because they don't get their lots until they do what they're supposed to do. So there's something hanging out there. So if there are any questions now, or we can go through the public process.
Jeff?
I have one question that is an outlier. It wasn't covered by your presentation, but I'm a somewhat casual student of covenants in subdivisions. And I've had a parcel that had the most incredibly racist covenants that you wouldn't believe, as long as other ones. And it's always fascinated me that while covenants are a private agreement, a civil agreement between parties, they are set by the developer. And in looking at the comp plan, many of the covenants may conflict with comp plan goals, and they supersede it. And I'm just a little bit curious, since we're looking at the topic, what kind of linkage might be considered in the new rewrite between private covenants that are recorded as part of subdivision process and ensuring they're consistent with the plan. And my example that I could give you would be, let's say somebody had an 80-acre parcel and it was zoned for 20 units per acre, but they decided to do 5-acre hobby farms. And then they slapped a covenant on it that said, these shall not be subdivided, ever. Obviously, there's a disconnect there, and I'm just a little bit curious about comp plan consistency of private agreements that are set by the developer, not necessarily by the residents, because by the time you buy the parcel, that's already been fixed and recorded, and you have to live with it. And many of them may be voluntary agreements that people in large agree with, and others may be directly against the goals of the comp plan, and then they're fixed and recorded for perpetuity.
That is it's definitely a topic we can discuss that I think actually would probably initiate with the legal review of that. And private covenants and agreements are typically things we don't even see. And so they're enforceable from the private, and whether the city has any authority within that's probably the question to be asked. What we do with private covenants right now is, if there are to be private covenants that are recorded concurrently with a plat, then the city reviews them to ensure that they do not conflict with city regulations. So that's what we do. And when they do conflict, that's not to say that we cannot prohibit them from going forward, but we at least inform the developer why they conflict. So you can imagine in view areas, they will want to lower the height of certain lots so that the lots above are pretty much guaranteed view in perpetuity. So what we are faced with at times, and we will tell them, well, our height restrictions actually allow you to go higher, and they're like, well, we want to establish these limits. So then sometimes we are faced with the situation of a homeowner coming in, not having read their covenants. We approve something that meets city code, but it violates the covenants. And that's a situation that obviously we don't ever like to be in, but it's not a situation that I don't know that we can prevent. But your point's taken from the big picture, but we also see it in the specifics of how they develop the lots as well.
Anyone else? I have just one question. You've referred several times to performance-based standards. Could you give a 35-second example of what a performance-based standard might be?
Well, I don't know if I want to give necessarily a specific example as opposed to how that might look. And they could be trade-offs. It could be, you may not have a minimum lot design standard if you guarantee certain design provisions. Or you may not have to do this if you give something else in return. So it's sort of that trade-off of, here's your prescriptive, you can do this. You can be given some flexibility, but you're going to do something in return for that flexibility. And that's hopefully where you better the project, you go that next step up, and it will give us the opportunity to say, you know, that type of design or that kind of lot or that type of unit really works better here given the physical constraints. And here are some design provisions that go with that. Or here's some additional open space that, you know, for parks or something like that. So it's performance-based. It's really looking at some flexibility, but there's a mutual exchange.
Tom, one thing that I could add to that is actually a good example maybe is a prescriptive standard of a 60-foot wide right-of-way. Why is that there? It's intended to make sure that there's access to lots. A performance-based standard may say, okay, we don't need a 60-foot wide right-of-way. We may only need a 40-foot wide right-of-way. And as long as we can ensure that access, you know, people can get to those lots through that road standard, which may be a little bit different, we're meeting that performance, that criteria to get there, and the overarching principle. So that's one example as well.
Okay, great, thanks. Anybody else? Well, then we'll go into the public hearing. We've got two people who have signed up, April Barker and Bill Geyer. So if April could come up and speak to us. You get about 3 minutes or so. And anybody else who has not signed up on the list, just come on up after Bill Geyer has spoken. Thank you.
Hi, I'm April Barker. I live at 3127 Birchwood Avenue in the Bellingham neighborhood. We've been meeting a lot lately because there's a lot of public hearings regarding things that affect our neighborhood with the comprehensive plan, with this subdivision suggestions, hopefully. Also, I think there's ADUs that's going to be coming up soon as well. So somehow I was hoping, I don't know how you're going to do it, but so I don't have to say the same things at all the different hearings, you could maybe keep the piece of paper on the side or add it? Do I have to keep adding it into each public hearing? Do you guys cross over, I guess, is what I'm wondering? Because this is unusual, I think, to have so many at one time that are so interrelated. So just, I guess you can't answer that, but think about that as we go along. And again, I have these 4 points, but some may be more suited for the comprehensive plan. I'm kind of a new student in all of this, so I'm not really sure. Maybe you could do a better job of deciding where you might take that information for yourselves. But one is, as you go through this process of figuring out how to better encourage infill, residential infill in our city and meet the demands of the state and of the people, I really hope that you would reach out and do something a little bit unusual, but include your school board into some of your discussions. And the reason for that is the Birchwood neighborhood is a place where I can see where you might see a lot of green and decide that there's some room for infill, and you might be able to change some standards so that that infill can happen. However, Birchwood Elementary was recently built to its complete full spec of what it could be for that lot. It's the last large lot there really that could be for a school. We just opened, and unexpectedly within the first 2 months I work at this school, staff was forced to convert the computer lab into a classroom and actually move out, and we're using both of the mobile units that were left there. So it is very important. I think we've shown with some of the bonds and different things that have been, and levies that have been passed, that we are a community that values our neighborhood schools. We put the money where our mouth is for that, and we really value especially walking elementaries. And as we continue to push the infill, I hope that it will be thoughtful, especially in relation to our children. That you might end up moving into a neighborhood, and lo and behold, you're going to have to bus your child out to another school that's not as full. And I would like to not see that happen. I think if we involve the school board in talking with some of the members there, that you might be surprised what they might have to offer you. And it might help them to start proactively planning for some of the changes that might occur if some of these changes or the comprehensive plan changes are going to create quite a bit more density and maybe younger family density, that they can go ahead and maybe secure lands that we wouldn't have expected to make sure that we can have the things that we value as a community here. The second one is regard to solar security. A lot of these unusual lot sizes have provided some really interesting sun exposure in a place where we don't get a lot. I know that in the 70s, I think maybe the 80s, somebody built onto the back of our 1920s. We call it the tumor, which we love, but it is the tumor. Doesn't quite go with the front of the 1920s portion house, but the person did develop it to be passively solar, and it's been wonderful. I mean, if there's sun in Bellingham, nearly all of our friends joke that you got to come to our house and you'll get it. If people were allowed to subdivide their lots and or build an ADU in the back, it could greatly impact how we utilize our passive solar. Also, as far as gardening and other things like that, it could affect that. And I don't see, I'm not really up to speed, but I didn't see anything in the single-family zoning that works on that. But I know other communities have looked at it, and I think as we start to do these divisions or suggest them, that if we are proactive in that, it might calm a bit of the community that's really nervous about what they already do with their land and how that might affect them. The third is looking at food security and urban farming, and this is kind of interesting. It gets a lot of media coverage. Urban agriculture is very different than community gardens because it assumes a level of commerce and the growing of product to be sold as opposed to being grown for personal consumption and sharing. There's 2 urban farms in the Birchwood neighborhood, and they're successful, and they're valued in the community. I think with continued support and incentives, large lots that are challenging to infill could be encouraged to bring jobs and promote food security within Bellingham. Birchwood is an excellent example where a large population struggles with issues of poverty, living in highly dense areas along Northwest Avenue and West Maplewood. This combination creates a highly impacted population. They're at the highest risk for health challenges such as obesity and drug use. Just adjacent to this population is a very low-density population with large lots. Food is a big business, and localizing the food system can have major community wealth building benefits. And although infill is extremely important to protect our farmlands, our fish, and our wildlife, as well as our environment, Bellingham City should not lose sight of the value of a large lot in an urban area. Encouraged to design appropriately for urban agriculture, large lots could create jobs, positively impact the economy, build community, and encourage healthy lifestyles with ready access for fresh and healthy foods. So I hope that your vision can be broad when you're looking at these kinds of things. And the last is neighborhood plans. We all worked really hard on those. That's a lot of time and energy that goes. They are updated on occasion. They're out there and they're at your fingertips, and I hope that you'll take the time to read what the neighborhoods have put forward for you. It really shows a lot of our needs and our wants. So I hope you'll use those documents. Thank you.
Thank you, April. Bill?
Oops. Yeah, you did. Where's your PDF access? Did you hide that? Might do it. Try the PowerPoint. Right over here. Which one's your file access? Oh, I don't need my glasses. I can read this a bit. I'm looking for your...
It said, if you go on top of that, it said, what did it say? Your device is ready.
There we go. All right. So where's your file access now? It doesn't show the files. I just got one slide in there. I want to get into one slide. It's in the drive.
I don't know.
Heather? It'll be over here. There we go. Yeah, you have. Okay, thank you for your patience. For the record, Bill Geyer, Geyer & Associates, 1008 16th Street, and just need to mention a couple things. I'm certified by the American Institute of Certified Planners and been in the field for about 37, 38 years now. And I say that because I came prepared tonight to make some general comments on what I think are two specific issues, and in your grappling with this policy advisory role you have for an ordinance that's going to have at least a 20-year and maybe longer legacy for this community. This is a very important task that you've undertaken, and I know you're very much aware of that, but I just want to underscore that for the record and for those that are watching this. So there's two issues, lot yield and cost, I'm going to talk about. And I also want to talk about issues of policy, those things that affect how you formulate this policy, and some very important things that I don't believe have been brought forward to you yet. And I'm going to leave you then with 4 metrics, the kind of takeaways that I would hope that these are metrics that you would ask yourself all along the way as you go about rewriting this ordinance and recommending to our council what they should do. But the piece I wanted to throw in towards the front end, because I was listening to the historical context tonight, and in the planning field you have, in planning education, you have a very broad wealth of education as to the history of cities and how countries developed. And I will offer an alternate view of what's been presented early this evening, where we know that the history of this country has come about by individuals that chose by their own volition to spend their money to do things, to create land, create docks, create cities, build ships, build towns, build churches, build schools. In fact, I was fortunate to recently be reading the history of young George Washington. as a surveyor. And surveyors at that time paid for all of their own equipment, as those of us in business understand, but also would go out and procure people that would pay them to go into the wilderness and chart courses and take measurements. And he did this throughout the Ohio Valley, where my ancestors lived and prospered, at least one side of the family. And he also was in upstate New York and other areas, where the other side of my family, and I'll take the chairman's prerogative here of my Dutch heritage, along with your Norwegian heritage, so I can make disparaging remarks about the Dutch. Anyway, but it's a little known fact that when Washington was doing his survey work, that started the conflict in the French-Indian War, because there were land surveys that were done to identify lands to be conveyed to another individual, and it was a commodity. It was a business transaction, because the Crown said, go forth and engage into the frontier. Now, why am I going on? This is 300 years ago. Because that private investment would not have occurred unless someone had the fortitude to step forward and invest and create something so more people could follow. It's no different today with the ordinance you are looking at tonight. Because at its core, a subdivision ordinance's purpose is to mesh what the private individual wishes to do with what he or she or the company owns to how they work within the municipal utilities and common things that we as citizens of Bellingham own. We all own the water system. We all own the sewer system. We own the road systems. We own the drainage system. We are the owners. You look at our charter, the people of Bellingham. So we have to merge those in a proper context so it's safe, secure, and healthy. It's not the other way around, where this unit of government that happens to have 9 municipal judge, 9 elected officials that are mandating and telling individuals how thou shalt invest. It's quite the diametric opposite. It is the private investment that's putting forth something that will serve the marketplace so people can live and work, enjoy their farms, enjoy their gardens, enjoy their households. But there's a responsibility as well as to build those items so that they can have longevity and they can last and they don't just degrade within a year or two. And I really think that's an important perspective, because yes, you have an obligation of your own free time, volunteering, God bless you for doing that you're then offering up a professional opinion as commissioners to our elected officials of what should be the legacy for the next 20 to 25 years of how land gets either divided or created in this community. I'm really going to encourage you now with my remainder of my comments to not get lost in the weeds. Yes, there are important things as to how lot line adjustments, short plats, and other things, and I'll touch on a few of them. They're very important items, but please, I believe the Planning Commission, and you know your role is to be the arbiter, protector, and defender of the comprehensive plan, and to recommend to the council the directions you think are necessary that fulfill that comprehensive plan. That's much more important than trying to decide if a line is 1.2 feet long or if it's 7.8 degrees in slope, okay? And here's what I mean. 2 major points: unit yield, cost. Unit yield, we all are very familiar with the zoning code and the densities that it establishes across the city. I'll take, for example, say a 4-acre lot, and let's say that it has a 4 unit per acre density, 10,000 square foot lot, okay? 4 times 4, my public school math tells me 16 units, okay. Over the years, the planning staff has done a good job of having an inventory of the subdivisions that have been recorded and built in this community. And this goes back approximately 25, 30. Greg left. I was going to give him kudos here. I hope he comes back. Greg started this inventory when he was very first an intern when I was working with the city. We discovered that the unit yield, if you have 16, the question is how many lots actually get built in a new subdivision? The percentage continually goes down. It was roughly in the 80% range, okay? So instead of 16 units, you would have had 12. Does that work? 13? Okay, close there. You have lesser units is the point. And that unit yield, I believe, has continued to go down, and I'll talk about that in a second. So you have land that you decide what you think should have as far as the number of units there, but it doesn't achieve that. Here's the other side of that coin, or another arm to this issue, cost. In the 70s and in the 80s, as this private investment was responding to build then the growing population that was moving here, some of you that here preceded when I arrived in '85, in the 70s, you remember that there was a very much, well, there's only one gray hair up there, so I'll point to Steve, but at that time, it was a low economy. But the cost of creating a new single-family lot as it relates to the price of the home that is eventually sold to the family, at that time, the cost of that lot, so this is all of your improvements, to have a service lot, vacant land that then goes to with a water, sewer, and road connection, okay? That cost approximately 12 to 14% of the price of the new home, 12 to 14%. In the 80s, that rose to about 24 to 26%. And if you go back into the real estate research report, which the staff has in their library, and I believe some of you subscribe to, you will see as this progresses forward to now the 21st century, the last decade or so, this number has actually risen, in some cases 29%, some cases 33% of the cost of a new home. It's more costly. Now, if that dynamic has shifted so drastically, almost a threefold increase, we started at 10%, we're about 33% now, right? Okay. The homeowner and what they get and what they purchase is having to put more of their income and their capital towards that land as opposed to what they're living in and enjoying. The kitchens shrink, the houses shrink, you have less quality, et cetera. That dynamic is documented. And there are several pieces to that now come home to roost to you and this legacy of this ordinance in these particulars. During the late 90s, we all know the Growth Management Act adopted 1990, 1991, and several things the city has done in response to that. We've adopted, first, a very minor wetlands ordinance, which was then upgraded to a full critical areas ordinance, which had some protective components. We recently adopted a newer drainage ordinance, not only in how we create the city's drainage utility, but then how individuals must interact with it. That is what you pay and what you build when you hook onto it. We've adopted newer street standards, okay? We have adopted several parks components, and I'm not speaking of greenways here. I'm speaking of the parks component when you divide land, how much land you need to now set aside individually in your development towards that for parks and trails. We now have new components in our critical areas ordinance that speak to slopes, both the toe, that is the bottom, the toe of the slope, and the top of the slope, and areas outside of it, okay? You also have now, more recently, in the past year and a half, discussion from fire standards and the fire department as to delivery time of the fire apparatus, both trucks and Medic 1, to the homes. And that comes down to a point of how long the street will be, how many homes are on that street, how quickly can you get there from the fixed point fire stations that we as a community decided to have. Response times. When you take those factors, and this will now impact your policy decisions directly, each of those factors that I mentioned may have a direct impact on how much land is consumed to create that commodity that we call a house, a lot, or even an apartment site or a condo site for people to live in. It consumes the land. So you have less and less land. Yes, we have lands that are very difficult to build in this community. We know where those steeper slopes are, but you add on these other regulatory components and you begin to consume more of the land. What is the net effect? The net effect is, as these costs continue to rise as a percentage of the home, this unit yield is going to continue to squeeze. So, well, I respect the chairman asked me to hurry up, but I would also respectfully respond. We've listened for an hour to the staff, and this is an extremely important issue that will be long in your deliberation. So I just have a couple more sections to finish, and I thank you. But that unit yield comes down. And so what then it comes to is the policy direction that I would really encourage you to take forth. That is, you have already adopted before and continue to support the comprehensive plan. And if you go back into the primary goals, as the state Supreme Court has directed us, the comprehensive plan is the basis for the development regulations that control the development of property. This is a development regulation. You need to base on the comprehensive plan. The Supreme Court was very clear on that. So you have to have consistency. And I'm all in with the comprehensive plan's mandate as far as the infill requirements and the average densities. That's key. The average densities that we have said are important for this community. Approximately 6 units per acre is what we're striving towards. It's an aspiration, okay? But we're not there. So I think what you need to do on each of these components, when you look at the ordinance, I would ask you to have these 4 metrics in mind. Number 1, will the ordinance improve the unit yield? That is, will it increase the number of lots? If we buy into the plan's development patterns and the zonings that we have attached to it, we've already made that decision of how many units should go into that area. And I'm looking at several of the commissioners right now. We had a very in-depth discussion on this 2 years ago on a certain rezone challenge, and you made a decision. But you were making a decision as to what you felt was appropriate for that area. And I think the comp plan is your basis for that. So when this development regulation, this ordinance you are going to write, you need to ask that question. Will the ordinance improve unit yield? We don't want to be at 75, 78%. You want to be higher, okay? Number 2, will the ordinance lower or raise the cost of a new lot as it relates to that home price? We cannot as a community afford to continue to have the land component creeping beyond 1/3 of the cost of a new home. It's the wrong equation for a number of reasons I could get into, and some other bankers would, other bankers would tell you the same. Number 3, third metric out of 4. Will this ordinance increase the average density within the single-family zones citywide? If we all accept infill as a primary goal within the comprehensive plan, and we have done that, and we know that the market is clear that 2/3 and greater of home buyers are preferenced for single-family homes, we need to start looking at other housing forms to meet that need. But we can't get there if the implementation ordinances, the subdivision ordinance, prevents us from increasing the average density. We've got to increase the average density. And number 4, will this ordinance increase or decrease the housing forms that can be built in Bellingham? Commissioner Brown made an excellent point earlier when you talked about access to lots. I would rephrase that a little bit to say that it's actually frontage versus access. Frontage is just the physical design on a map that says this lot has a measured distance on a right-of-way. Access is, can you get from the house to the road? And as we've heard tonight from the staff as well, I agree, we have had this policy where we look at frontage and access as one and the same, and it prevents meeting these metrics that I've talked about. That's just one example. So I really hope that as you go into this, and I put the original town of Bellingham on the screen here because that was done at the time, and if you look at the fine print in there, and I would hope this would go into the record, you look at it, those larger tracks down there, right in here, those are tracks reserved for the mill, reserved for the railroad. And then you have all these smaller lots that still exist today. And it was private investment that created that. And I think I would really encourage you that those 4 metrics I mentioned will help guide you in this ordinance so that it continues to allow for the investment to occur with a safe, habitable function within the city's utilities. And thank you for your time.
Thanks, Bill.
Hello, my name is Ralph Bach, for the record, 3101 New Market Street. I've had the unique experience of serving on the Affordable Housing Task Force, participating with staff in these meetings, as some of you as well have done. And I do want to thank staff and everybody. We're long overdue. Overhaul this thing. We're really long overdue. It's been interesting listening to a lot of the testimony tonight. I really wasn't going to speak because I didn't know it was a public hearing, but I think having listened to a few things, I think I do want to speak. One thing I would really encourage you as commissioners to do is maybe what we should have is some form of a work session, brown bag lunch. I think it would be good for you to sit and talk to the people on the other side of the counter that deal with this on a daily basis. As Kathy said, she deals with it every day. I deal with it every day, those of us that are in this industry. I'm glad she gave you a copy of Title 18. If you can't sleep tonight, just get a cup of cocoa and start reading Title 18. You'll be out in 5 minutes, and you'll have a good night's sleep. It's complicated. It's a lot of moving parts. I think both sides, both the developmental industry, the building industry, and staff agree that there are a whole series of things that need to be addressed. There's technical things that are, I think, fairly simple to wash through the system, that are kind of hangovers from all these little modifications we've done over time. I'll give you a real short example. We developed open space requirements at a time when we didn't have a comprehensive park plan and we didn't have park impact fees. So what happens today is when you develop a plat, a long plat, you give up percentage of open space that the public doesn't want, public being the city of Bellingham. So you end up with a 15 or 20% of your project dedicated to open space that the public won't accept, and now becomes private open space and ends up just a field over time or whatever it is. And you still have to then pay park impact fees. So you get double dipped. You lose the land for development, for bringing more units online, and then you still pay park impact fees because now we have a comprehensive park plan. So we know where we want trails to go. We know where we want parks to go. We should wash the code so it's a one or the other. It's either a dedication of open space that the city needs, or if we're not dedicating open space, we're simply paying into park impact fees, and the open space is then used for development. Those are just simple technical things that we can wash the code fairly quickly on. The broader questions that I think would be interesting to hear from people in the building and developmental community is how do we deal with creating greater flexibilities? I think both staff and the developmental industry and building industry agree that we need to have greater flexibilities, especially as we get into not only infill. Infill has its own set of problems, but also greenfield. How are we able? These are long processes. I'm in a project right now. It might be 20 plus years of build out, maybe longer. How do I know what I want to build 20 years from now? I don't. How do we create flexibility so as we move through these projects, move through these areas, we can morph into what the market wants, morph into cottages, morph into zero lot line, morph into different types of housing types mixed in within the general project. One of the things I think we've done a bad situation of doing in the past is we tend to sort of ghetto housing. We have all of the multi in one site, and we have all the single family over here, and we have all this over here. We don't really blend them into one neighborhood. We don't blend in neighborhood commercial, little markets, little coffee shops, things like that. The code doesn't allow it. We don't have that flexibility of blending it in when we need to do it without a very long, complicated process. And so we need to look at those. But I would encourage, I'm going to make it real short here, but I would really encourage for the commission to get an opportunity to meet with the building and development industry and just listen to what it is that our perception of where the problems are. So as we move forward, you can have an understanding of what the industry says are the reasons why we haven't used the infill toolkit. Why haven't we used the infill toolkit since it was created? Isn't that a logical question? You get a bunch of builders in here, they'll tell you really quickly why it's never been used. Far too prescriptive, far too difficult to do what the infill toolkit says. And so bring them in and understand, given what circumstances would you be able to utilize these things that we're developing? I just encourage it. It was great listening to the conversation. I really want to thank staff. The meetings were good. Those of us that attended, they were great meetings. They were very open. Staff was very open to what people were having to say. There was a lot of apprehension always going into these meetings, and it was not an adversarial situation whatsoever. I think it was a very cooperative situation. I think depending the direction you give staff, we should be having more of these. as we morph this thing together, and hopefully we can get a set of regulations and rules that will really benefit us over the next 20 years, and not be here 5 years from now arguing about, well, why did we go this direction because we can't build that now? And now it's stuck in the code, and now we're in the same situation that we are right now. So flexibility should be your guidance on this thing. I've probably seen more changes in the last 5 to 10 years in the building industry than I have in the first 20 years of the building industry. And it's changing. We're doing a project right now, fiber optic, fiber to the home. That whole new, what's this whole home industry going to be like? Now that we have fiber to the homes, what will be the regulation regarding people that want to have home businesses or home software companies within neighborhoods? How can we create something where we can have these businesses within the neighborhoods without tripping code issues? There's a lot of this flex space thing now that's being discussed in a lot of people. A lot of people work at home. So how do we put those within the regulations to allow that to happen so someone doesn't invest in fiber to the home and put a home business together, then trips a code issue, and now it can't be done. So, great. Any questions? I'd be happy to come sometime and talk with any of the commission. I can be happy to facilitate the meeting or talk to the BIA. I'm sure they'd be happy to facilitate a brown bag lunch where we could just all sit around in a very informal basis and discuss the issues that we have. Thank you.
Thanks, Ralph.
Hi, David Cunningham again from the Birchwood Neighborhood Association. The previous two speakers had some good points, had some points I really disagree with. And one of the things I'm thinking about is brown bag lunches with developers doesn't sound like something that actually benefits the community and the individual neighborhoods. One of the things that I'm very concerned about is that, let me give you a little background first. I was on the Monterey City Planning Commission for many years, and I was also a contractor for 25 years, so I kind of know this from both sides of the fence. And one of the things that I found was that, generally speaking, at Planning Commission meetings and most public meetings like this that I've come to, the people with a vested financial interest in the outcome generally have much better representation than the community and the average person in the city. One of the things that I always thought of as a planning commissioner is that I'm that representative, and that the people that are coming here with a vested interest are basically lobbyists for a particular point of view. Now, we have neighborhood associations. I really appreciate April coming and having your input. I've just started coming recently, and I feel like because of her input and her efforts to try to get the Birchwood neighborhood represented in a way that actually has some effect on the outcome, I think that that's what we need to look more for, input from the people who are not having the opportunity to give that input. So I'd really like you to kind of look at this whole process, not just this particular, the subdivision ordinance, but also looking at, one of the previous people was talking about the difference between infill and greenfield development. And one of the things that I see is that infill development has a whole different need than greenfield, because when you're doing greenfield development, you can create standards, have the flexibility to create something that really makes a nice neighborhood. When you're doing infill development, the most likely outcome of that is increased density, higher traffic, and lower quality of life in neighborhoods. And so I think that one of the problems that you're going to face in neighborhoods, all the neighborhoods, not just Birchwood, in Bellingham, is that there are a lot of people who have moved here, myself included, that really value the quality of life we have here in Bellingham. And I left Monterey 20 years ago because the quality of life deteriorated so badly because of some of the really poor development standards. They've done a good job since then of doing things a little differently, but I think that Bellingham has a quality of life that's hard to find anywhere. And I would hate to see people from outside with an outside that come here, spend some money to buy some land, develop it, and take the money away, and they don't even live here, damaging that quality of life. So I really appreciate the service that you people are giving, and I hope you keep the neighborhoods in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Louise?
Hello again. Thank you again for your service. It's a really important job, and I know it takes a lot of time, but it's a very important job. I probably agree with a lot of the staff recommendations that are coming up, and they would be fine. But as I said last week, I am concerned about the future quality of life in our neighborhoods, especially in our existing older neighborhoods, which do not have covenants to protect them. We in Bellingham have always prided ourselves on not having the other side of the tracks. You may remember when the Leonard Street neighborhood needed some extra help. We saved a lot of the neighborhood for the single-family zone, fixed up the sidewalks, and added park space. What I noticed all over the city when I was on the city council and before that on the planning commission, when the zoning was stabilized, people respond by fixing up their homes, improving their neighborhood, and becoming a better place to live, versus them leaving at the first opportunity. In Olympia, Senate Bill 5567, which was passed in 1995, addressed this concern after the Growth Management Act was passed. They went back and made a special edition, quote, providing for the preservation of single-family residential neighborhoods, unquote. This was a special act that they went and passed in 95. Cities must, end quote, recognize the vitality and character of established residential neighborhoods, unquote. There was a concern that there was not strong enough to adequately protect single-family residential neighborhoods, so they said cities must include provisions, and I quote, to ensure, and rather than just recognize, the vitality and character of established residential neighborhoods. I'm especially concerned about Alderwood, Birchwood, and Cordata, as I mentioned before. They don't have their fair share of parks and open space. The elementary schools have a high proportion of free and reduced lunches. Alderwood is 82%, Birchwood is 67%, and Cordata is 64%. That's 64% of the kids get free and reduced lunch because they are so low income. We have diversity, but not economic diversity. Birchwood has already over 5,200 people, lots of apartments and more being built in commercial, but we don't have our share of parks and open space. The neighborhood plan since 1980 states there should be a park in the northwest part of the neighborhood. The parks plan has a nice green swath in the area, but no parks are planned. Meanwhile, more and more apartments are being built. And now I understand someone is trying to change the subdivision ordinance to affect this older established neighborhood. It wouldn't add much housing, but it would be a huge impact in that neighborhood. The neighborhood plan since 1980 says the lots are too narrow to be divided. People purchase their homes based on that information, and they expect predictability from the city. If the backyards were taken away now, where would any quality of life in that already troubled low-income neighborhood? The biggest attraction and quality of life in that neighborhood is the backyards, long ago platted for victory gardens. Growing our food in that great soil will be even more important in the future. Our neighborhoods have value. Please protect them. I have a copy of the stats from the school district on the free and reduced lunches and the percentages of each school. So if you'd like to pass that on. And I also have the summary bill of Senate Bill 5567, which was passed in 95. So you can see the quotes that I read. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Is there, okay.
Tim Cornwell, 2861 Leeward Way, Bellingham.
I'm kind of new to all of this, the developing land and real estate game. I got involved in it about 4 years ago. And I used to live in Ferndale and sat on the planning commission there for a little while. So I kind of relate to what you guys are up against and all of the huge amounts of information you have to try to process and make good judgments on. So I appreciate what you guys are doing. It's definitely a thankless job, so I thank you. And then just like I said, being new to all this and encountering the staff and taking on some projects that were probably over my head. And I've always enjoyed working with the city and the staff. Most of the time it's been my ignorance of how the system works that's caused my stress. And but I've spent a lot of time at the counter down at the planning department. And I'm down there probably once or twice a week now. Currently I have my real estate license and I represent builders and smaller developers and just trying to figure out solutions for infill in Bellingham. And I'm just encouraged. I guess that's the word I want to use is I'm encouraged that the process is happening. There's been times where, I'll be there with the planner and we're looking at a piece of property and we're both scratching our head going, how do we make this work? And they've got rules that they have to live within and I'm just excited that now we're going, there are some things we could improve on. And I was on one of those technical teams, right? Is that right? Okay, I didn't know what that was called. I just thought we were going to a room to talk about this stuff. So that was cool. That was encouraging. So the whole dialogue and everything that everyone's sharing, it sounds really good to me. I'm looking forward to the process. I think a couple groups you might want to think about inviting would be the Association of Realtors. I think they have a lot of just a perspective that would be helpful, as well as I think property management companies are super important to get involved. Maybe the principal from a property management company so that they can share. They see it from both sides, the tenant and what the tenant's up against and the type of person that's renting property. And then they also see it from the investor side, developer side, what their needs are. So it might be helpful as we look at these different things. The one last thing I wanted to throw out at you guys that I found incredibly valuable to me is City IQ. Has anybody not been on City IQ on the Planning Commission? You all know what it is? Okay, cool. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak to the commission at this time? Seeing nobody rushing to the podium, we'll close this part. And staff, do you have some response to these different points, or?
I'm not so sure a response to these points are necessarily appropriate at this stage. I think that there's a lot of good information that was presented. I think it should all be considered. I certainly don't want to respond to sound not supportive or supportive because we're at such the beginnings of this. There's a lot of knowledge that is within Bellingham and Bellingham proper or Whatcom County that I think is going to add a lot of value to this process. And our goal is to have an open and transparent process. And that's why truly we came to you the first time with nothing recommended. That's not what staff wants to do. We don't want to sit here and present something that staff wants. We want something that's going to work for the community, and there's going to be a balance of what the development community needs, what the real estate community needs, what the lenders are actually going to lend, and then also what the neighborhoods needs and wants. So there's going to be a lot of conversation to come. What I want to present in my closing comments, I'm going to read from a book, because I found this to be pretty fascinating. And I guess I'll preface this by saying when I was doing some research, not only in planning education, but also some of what our I realized that I came across this paragraph, and it'll be quick, so less than 3 minutes, I promise, that I thought was pretty profound, and it actually made me read the front to see when it was written, because it should sound all too familiar. And it says, however, speculative periods historically were followed by price collapse. In fact, many of America's biggest panics and depressions were touched off by overspeculation in land and a bust in land prices, carrying down hundreds of banks and other lending institutes. Tax delinquency and foreclosure rates were staggering, and the wastage of land appalling. Unsuitable land was developed, poor locations were selected, lots were too small to be built on, and the cost of installing utilities to scattered subdivisions added to the financial troubles of many municipalities. These abuses finally resulted in change in American attitudes. It took a giant boom and bust to alert Americans to the many dangers of unrestricted development and to establish a sympathetic climate for land division controls. And that comes from a book called The Subdivision and Site Planning Handbook by Listokin and Walker. And when I read that, I thought, wow, this is a recent book, because that's exactly what I feel like we're just coming off of. And the book was actually, it was actually written in the late 80s. So history repeats itself, and hopefully we get better every time. And that's what we're searching for, is to find that better. We're trying to find that place that's going to guide us in the future, but we want it to guide us in a way that we can respond to these types of changes. I don't know that we necessarily have to change the ordinance in order to move forward, but I think we have to change the ordinance to move forward in a better way. And I think that's what we're all striving for, is to try to find that better way. What I would like to do right now is to propose to the Planning Commission that we maybe turn the lights a little bit, only because it's really light. Is I would like to at least propose a process. The blue shows where we are. To the left of that shows where we've been. We've heard some recommendations, some action items from chat, which we presented. Staff has presented an overview, which Mr. Geyer, we seeked his guidance to look at a project brief that sort of outlined many of the items that he's talked about. We then took all of that information. We met with technical groups to really get their expertise, and so that we could start looking forward rather than looking behind. And we're here tonight as our first step to present to you not only just some education as to what the subdivision process is, but now we're asking you to help staff guide this process as we move forward by looking at these objectives and these goals that we have set forward to see if we're in the right direction. Are we moving in the right direction? Do those goals and objectives need to be modified? Are they broad enough? Are they too specific? Can we move forward? They are, and that's what we're asking. That is the very fundamental principle that staff is asking for the Planning Commission tonight, is your recommendation on those objectives and goals. And to briefly look at this and to see, are we going to do more public outreach? And to break down into subcommittees of the Planning Commission so that we can take a few, work on the specific issues, hammer through those issues while public outreach is continually feeding in, so that we can then bring a product back to you that has some technical review by the Planning Commission subcommittee, but it also has been led by some discussion from public outreach. So this is what we're trying to do. We're kind of looking to you guys to say, hey, it sounds like a great idea. Have you considered, would you want to put in, these additional steps? But more importantly, as important, I would say, are looking at those action items, which are the goals and the objectives that we have in the staff report. So that would conclude my presentation. just some at a time.
Kathy? Kathy,
Yeah, yes.
do you have a recommended date for the second to last?
Just turn that off. We'll get back there.
Block to accomplish? What date?
We don't have dates yet. And as of right now, we will establish, the idea is to establish some internal working goals. But more importantly, I don't want to move a process along just because we have a deadline and a goal to meet. I would rather bring forward a product that is suitable for what we're looking at rather than rushing something just to get it here. We are not mandated to do this process within a specified period of time. But we also don't want to take 2 to 3 years to do this. So that's what's somewhat unique about this, and that this is not a comp plan amendment where everything's going to be done by July. We're not on a regulatory time frame. It doesn't have to be done before the comp plan. We hope it is. So there is no time frame. We will somewhat self-manage that because we need momentum. We need to keep it going.
Kathy,
Yes.
can I ask a quick
Yeah.
question? I think when looking through Title 18, one of the things to consider obviously is that when someone goes to do a subdivision and is working through Title 18 ordinances, that they get redirected to street standards and critical areas ordinances, and there's a lot of different other ordinances that tie into this. So as looking at these goals, maybe we can break out what the city can actually do versus, Department of Ecology, stormwater, and focus on the goals that we know that we could have an impact on. I see that as being a struggle. When you get into the technical aspect of it, how do we do that? And, how do we identify the things that we can actually, is it street width? Is it, fire? What are the things that we actually have administrative review over?
Those in that detail is what we were hoping to accomplish more through public outreach and through subcommittees. Because to have those kinds of conversations in such a large group, where hopefully we can go through those in smaller groups and then come back and say, these are the, in summary, these are the things that we've determined can't be changed with the subdivision, and any modifications would require a completely separate process. Or these are the things that are mandated by state or by federal regulation. And so then we can basically establish a hierarchy of what can't be changed and then what can be versus what's not going to be changed now. So point well taken.
Yeah, because I think that is one of the bigger things is, we're hearing that flexibility is needed to be able to react to these changing circumstances. If stormwater regulations change, what in our code can we provide flexibility so that they can meet the intent?
Yes, and that in itself, that will be a challenge. There's no doubt that will be a challenge. But what we hear, at least, is that the Public Works Department is also going to be moving along in the beginning of 2015 modifications to their standards. So the timing isn't a coincidence, but hopefully they fall in line so that many of those issues will be considered concurrently with what we're doing here so that they will come together. Much of, as you know, stormwater regulations, they're mandated by the state. Critical areas, many of them are mandated by the state. So there's a lot of provisions that have, minimum state requirements, and we're not going to be able to affect those. And it is true. Those are the things that, as we get deeper and start to talk about those flexibilities, start to talk about designs of subdivisions, housing neighborhoods, those are things that will definitely need to be brought to the table.
The things that the city has jurisdiction over.
Yeah. Yep.
On that topic, you mentioned earlier that changes we make to the subdivision ordinance ultimately may result in inconsistencies with other sections of the code that we would then, during the presentation, you kind of mentioned that we would then try to kind of scrub those out of those other code sections so that everything matched up. And what I just heard was that the Public Works Department might be bringing like a wholesale update to Title 15. 13. And that was, so that's a little bit different approach, or those are two different approaches. I'm curious, what's the intent? Because I can see that juxtaposition right there. I can just think in my head right now like three different things that we might change in this that would create inconsistency with language in Title 13. So would we fix it here and wait for them to fix it, or would we try and fix it here and incorporate those minor changes in those other codes now as a part of this?
So one of the things that we're finding when we're looking at other municipalities, for example, not very many municipalities in their subdivision ordinance dictate what the street standard is in their subdivision ordinance. Those are dictated in the street requirements. More than not, put any zoning regulations, lot width standards, anything doing with the creation of a lot, it goes into their land development ordinance. It's not in their subdivision ordinance. It's a development standard. It's exactly what Mr. Geyer said. There are development standards associated with this. We need to differentiate what those are and decide where they live and where they should live. There are many standards that are in the subdivision ordinance right now that have no business being in the subdivision ordinance. A density bonus in a subdivision ordinance most likely would better live in a zoning ordinance where we talk about density. So that's what I mean by there may be some things right now in Title 18 that may be better moved into other code sections, but at the same time, there may be other code sections coming forward that are completely different. And they're related, but they're not. But the opportunity to look at these two things together, because streets are a driving factor in subdivision design, it would be a great opportunity to be able to see how one's going to impact the other.
But would we attempt to make those changes as a part of this findings of fact and recommendation, or would we kind of earmark those items and go, okay, when that code comes up for review, we'll change it then, kind of thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Because otherwise what happens is if we establish street standards in the subdivision ordinance, then we have to go change Title 13. But if we change title, because otherwise you have inconsistencies in code. So if you don't change Title 13, then that's where your inconsistencies are going to live. So if you're going to go through that process, you might as well go through Title 13 and change your street standards.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those are some of the things that are being discussed right now. And we're definitely trying to keep I mean, they've been involved. They were in the technical groups. They're well aware of what we're doing, and we're definitely going to be bringing them to the table with discussions because they are a critical component to subdivision design, for sure. Because they regulate street, sewer, water, and stormwater, which are what shapes much of our subdivisions currently. So what we have up here initially are the process goals. So we have the process goals, and then the next are the objectives. And so these are the overarching what we want to do. We've identified some goals that will then, and we can put those up next, that will hopefully focus us in our ongoing conversations with public outreach. Just trying to understand if there's anything here where the Planning Commission goes, you're way off base. It looks like a good direction. These are nothing that are set in stone. We can always come back to them. We may even find as we move through the process that some of these need to be modified and we need to, redirect our objectives and, how we look forward. But this is based upon what we've heard today, primarily, and we've incorporated some of our experience into that.
Well, if I could, I think the goals are a good starting point, and just to say again, I mean, I think if we could start by breaking out and isolating the areas within the subdivision ordinance that could have an immediate effect and identify those as goals that can be worked on, we should do that. I mean, one of the things that was brought up was open space requirements. That sounds to me like strictly a subdivision ordinance, right? That doesn't have anything to do with streets or any other title. So, I mean, that was one area that could be looked at that could, maybe be an immediate impact, at least be evaluated. So I think we should add that to the, as a note to the goals to break it down to subdivision, Title 18.
So to add a goal.
Yes.
To identify.
The things that are within our immediate control that aren't going to get drug out in the process of all these other ordinances. And, you know, maybe we could have an immediate impact on that.
Okay.
Jeff?
Well, I wasn't going to jump in and endorse the particular wording on the goals at this point. Nothing gives me heartburn. I think it's a good starting point. I'm actually somewhat interested in what the process for the Planning Commission, what you had envisioned for that. I noticed on that flow chart it said committees, and I wondered, I believe it said committees. I wondered if this was not going to be one committee, and I don't know that it would be, how you would slice and dice this into overall areas of digestion among the Planning Commission. That might help, I guess, inform whether we want to adopt nod at the goals at this point, or just say, yeah, this is a good starting point. Let's figure out what the committees are and how to populate them, or I'm trying to think of the next step here.
My understanding is, and Greg can correct me if I'm not characterizing this, my understanding was that the question was prompted previously, who wants to be on a committee? And Steve and Phyllis were the two that said, yeah, we want to be on the committee. And so there's two committees that we think we're going to be focused on. One is the subdivision and the other is possibly the ADU. And it's an opportunity for staff to break out a smaller group as a subcommittee so that, you know, they're still representing the whole, but to work with staff and, you know, kind of bridge that gap of the public outreach so that as necessary, they can also say, hey, it's time to come back. I think we should come back to the whole, and I think these are some things that we need to discuss as a whole, or these are things that we should represent and come back as code amendments. I mean, we're really going to be looking for the guidance of the subcommittee. And so what our idea was, because both Garrett and Ali have been on the in the technical groups, and Steve and Phyllis, we've sort of asked for, you know, some availability. And Steve was earmarked to be on the subdivision where Phyllis would go on the ADU. And I don't know who else Mr. Cook has identified if there will be a subcommittee on that.
Was this discussed at the last meeting that I was absent?
No, Greg, it was some time ago, was it not?
Completely missed
When
it.
we talked about subcommittees, it was
early November. I was gone. I wasn't at the meeting.
Yeah.
I think it was the first meeting in November.
Yeah. So it was some time ago. So, I mean, we can have that discussion again. I mean, there's nothing that's so set, but the idea was to try to get, it's more time, it's more volunteer, and everybody's time is precious. And so we were trying to limit how many times we come back here as well, but of course reporting back on our findings as, you know, we make certain progress and certain steps. So it's not meant to do something in closed doors, but it's meant also to have those subcommittee members help staff, because sometimes we speak a different speak than you guys speak, and sometimes different than what the public speaks, and it's more of an opportunity to help. The subcommittees can help explain to the commission as a whole what the discussions were. It's just more faces being able to represent a topic, to relay what that information was.
Okay, well, I'll throw my name in the ring for, I didn't realize that there had been that discussion, so I'm certainly interested in being involved.
Just to clarify, so you're saying we're going to have two subcommittees, one on this topic and one on the ADU topic that hasn't been brought before us yet?
That's been tossed around as an idea to have an ADU subcommittee, but those are still some things that are being discussed. But clearly that would be my preference and is to have a subdivision subcommittee so that we can break into smaller groups and have those conversations.
Yeah, judging from what I heard, and I don't know what happened during those committees that our two commissioners were involved with, Ollie and Garrett, I think any time that we can do outreach for all 7 of us now and incorporate, let's find out from the other side of the plan here. Let's go out to the developers. Let's go out to the builders and the BIA and the realtors. And I think that to say that no, they can't input to this It'd be ridiculous just to hear from one side, from staff, and I'm not saying you're biased, but I'm saying let's get all the information we can. If we have no time restrictions, let's put together that working lunch and bring them in and sit down and find out what they have problems with.
So unless I am completely misinterpreting what you just said, what I want to do is completely the opposite of what you just said. The idea is to get that public outreach, to talk to these people, and to bring them back into a smaller focus group and then report back to the committee of the whole. One of the other ideas we've tossed around is possibly having work sessions so that we would have the work sessions in front of the committee or the whole planning commission. So it's quite the opposite. This is not going to be staff doing something and presenting it. This is going to be staff listening to the public outreach. We're going to rely on the subcommittee members to report back for consideration of the whole.
I don't care whether it's done before a subcommittee or the committee as a whole. I am encouraging that exchange to take place.
Yes, thank you. We are too. That's exactly where we want to go with this. Yes.
I don't know a lot about the rules that we have, but my understanding is that we can't have more than 3 of us together without it being like noticed, right? So if we're going to have feedback from user groups or whatever we want to call them, neighborhood associations or real estate associations, for all of us, we're going to have to, correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, but we're going to have like noticing of those meetings, and that's not the case with the subcommittee. So if we have like a 3-person subcommittee, we can just meet with people and groups.
And,
or do we
and
still
that's
have
not to say we're going to provide notice. You just can't have a quorum. I mean, there's rules to public meetings, and we'll certainly follow all the rules. And again, the idea is it's not to do anything closed door.
Sure.
And so we're still trying to figure out this process, and there's nothing there. And if people can benefit from listening to a conversation and then commenting on that, then yeah, that's something that we want to encourage. But we're definitely going to follow the open meeting, rules and all of those. But yeah, when you get a quorum, which is 4 of the 7, then there's a different set of circumstances. I mean, the city council does this all the time. And they have committees that then they report to the committee of the whole. So it sort of would be modeled after that.
That kind of relates to one of my questions, which is sometimes when you watch them on TV or come to the meetings, they have a committee, but then they'll have other council members like hanging out, just listening in, gaining education on the topic. So does that situation create a quorum issue if you have like a subcommittee and then someone else just shows up to learn something?
Those are all things that we're going to have to discuss. If Heather or Greg or Kurt know the answer to that, but we certainly are going to make sure that we're not violating
I just
anything.
asked because it sounds like maybe there's more than 3 of us who have interest in the topic.
I would agree
and want
with
to get
that.
like direct education
Yes.
on it
Yeah.
versus feedback from, not that I don't trust a committee to accurately represent what they learn at all, but I'm just curious because we haven't dealt with this yet really, well, for a lot of us.
Mm-hmm.
So it would help to get some direction from whoever our resident expert is on procedure. We have one.
Kathy, could you give a little bit of a description as to the 2 committees you're seeing now? You were mentioning that we volunteered and there were 2 committees that were set up or you're thinking of. Am I correct in that?
Correct. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Can you tell me a little bit about each one of those committees?
Well, one would be a subcommittee for this subdivision update process.
Okay.
And what is also coming forward are amendments to the accessory dwelling unit
Got it.
provisions. And so it would be a subcommittee for that.
Thank you.
Cerise.
I just wanted to also add, I like the idea of the brown bag lunch or whatever it is, but I really want to make sure that the neighborhoods and the public at large get included in that conversation. So however we can include all people, and I think Tim made a good point about, property management and renters, not just owners, and just sort of everyone that we can get to the table. I just think that would be really helpful too in the process.
I think some of the other things that would be extremely helpful, at least I know that I learn this on a daily basis from working with developers, is is what's on the financial side of it. And a lot of the times we don't have the opportunity to hear that. And a lot of what's driven is by that. And we always wonder, well, why don't we get this and why don't we get that? Sometimes it's not in always the market. It's not always in what the developer desires. It's actually what kind of money can they get to do it. So there's so many things that shape what we do. It's overwhelming at times. And will we be able to hit all of those? Probably not. But can we try to form a good broad base of knowledge so that we can come in and make an informed consent decision? That's what we're hoping to do. So we definitely have a lot of work to do to figure out how we're going to bring people together. But in order to do that, we want to go out to them with some focus. And that's the idea of the goals and the objectives, is so that we have targets, we have objectives in order to try to identify, and then from that will come the specifics, and we'll continue to work on the specifics that will eventually come to an ordinance. We're starting broad, we're going to get narrow.
Yeah, looking at your process goals, as I read it, items A through D, the first four, have to do with infill. And as we know, we've got quite a history on this subject. Tonight we had 3 very knowledgeable people from Birchwood step up, and I heard their comments, be careful with this issue. I think we've got a huge, huge task here to come up with these other housing forms, to figure out a way to make infill work and to make it work with the neighborhoods, and not put something in that we get 20 people lined up, says it's going to ruin the character of the neighborhoods. And if you're establishing basically 4 of those goals for this particular subject, I think it only speaks to the importance of it.
Yes.
Anybody else? Holly?
I think that the goals are great and provide a good basis for us to move forward. I think they're really broad. They pick up all of the topics that all the public speakers spoke about on both sides of the issue, on all 10, 20 sides of the issue that exist. And so, as a framework to say, let's look at all these things, I think it's a great. So I kind of was thinking, I agreed with what Jeff said earlier. It's a good way to start. There's nothing on this list that I say we shouldn't be talking about that. Let's take it off. So, if you're looking for direction from us in the form of emotion or just opinion.
Well, direction, yeah, and keep in mind that I think Garrett wants to make sure that his goal is in there, that through this process, the goal is to identify, what we can modify and what we can't, and to better understand that and to bring that back to the table. Did I accurately characterize that?
I would support adding that in some form.
Okay.
And I have a question. If we accept these goals and objectives, are they immediately set in concrete?
100%. No.
That's what I was afraid of.
No.
I worry about the bureaucracy.
And I spoke to that, and we're just starting. I mean, this is something that's going to be set in motion, and we may say, oh my gosh, this really doesn't make sense, or it's really covered in this one, we don't need this one, and I can't believe we forgot this. And so it's allowing it to be fluid as we go through, but I think Ollie's comment is well taken. They're broad, and they're meant to look at and tackle the tough issues. And this is what we've heard from our outreach. This is what they want us to focus on, and I think that those accurately characterize that.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments?
So Heather, what do they do? Just take straw votes kind of to support to move on? I mean, it's not really a, so just the conversation of, yeah, it looks good, that's enough to move forward. Okay.
So directed.
Thank you. So then, wait, well, I guess it could go like this. This works. we have here now are some objectives that we hope to obtain through those goals. There may be more, but I think all of those, you're going to see those seem really redundant. Well, they are redundant, but those are some that we've already identified. And is there any more that you think we should explore? Things from what you've heard tonight based upon your experience. You've all lived in a neighborhood. Some of you have developed land. Some of you have clients who develop land. I mean, we're truly trying to look to you guys for direction. And if you want to, again, use this as a starting point, we can do that, and then we can move forward from there. This is different. Like I said, for me, this has been fun tonight, believe it or not, because we're not up here trying to defend a position. We're up here really saying, where do you want us to go with this? I mean, you know the comp plan. We're trying to explain to you what some barriers are. We're trying to break those barriers down, and we're trying to develop a process to do that, and that's what we're asking for your assistance in.
Well, again, I think that's a reasonable starting point.
Okay.
That's not to say that I'm not going to throw mud all over it at some time. Or maybe I'll emboss it with gold. You never can tell.
Kathy, how do you see us going out and setting up brown bag lunches and getting together with people? Is that something that each one of us is supposed to go out and start networking, or that comes through staff?
Well, one of the things is this is a legislative process, so certainly any comments you receive, any comments you have, I mean, it can totally be the open dialogue from that. One of the things that Rick, our director, is really interested in is this very process. And so he's kind of brought in new life to it, and it's kind of fun. And we are actually at the beginning of the year going to sit and figure out how can we take that process timeline and add more specificity to that and really to go through that process. So we are all eager to figure out how that's going to move forward, but we certainly understand that public outreach is going to be the key here and to understanding what all the issues are. The idea is to bring something forward where not everybody's going to have buy-in, but at least we'll be able to understand the topics that people will have discussion points with. So Phyllis, we don't really know the answer to that yet. Honestly, this is so preliminary. The main purpose here was to help you understand what is a subdivision, what do they look like, why do we do them? You've heard from the public in many different perspectives, so you're already going to kind of understand what the process is going to give. And we're trying to move forward, but yet we don't really know how we're going to move forward yet because we want the process to be open to tell us how to move forward. We need to be flexible.
So we're not overstepping our bounds if we start to reach out to these people?
You can reach out.
Okay. Thank you.
Jeff?
I would just make one editorial comment on that. In my professional life, I deal with all sorts of interference and information flow from lobbyists to council members and all sorts of other things. And I would hope that we could not turn this into a lobbying festival. I would actually really appreciate having an organized flow of information so that we know which sectors have participated and which sectors haven't. And this is one of my pet peeves. I'm sure my fellow commissioners have heard this many times, but it essentially, a lot of these meetings come down to developers are over here, neighborhoods are over here. Well, the fact is neighborhoods for the most part are single family. And we've got a majority of people in this city that are renters. And it's not all Western students. It's a lot of young professionals. It's a lot of other people that want to live in a particular type of community, and their voice is almost never heard. So I would really like to hear, I guess, as far as a strategic plan for information flow to people, that we do seek information from all the different stakeholders in this, and we seek it in some kind of organized way so we can really professionally evaluate it and make sure we're not just trying to open season on ourselves to, start answering our phone and, whatever. So it's a caution there because sometimes things can get out of hand, and I think there are voices that have not been heard and haven't even been identified in this conversation tonight. Actually, you did touch on them, but you know, I do know there are a lot of renters that have really been roughshod over on the planning process over the past 10 years, and I'd really like to hear from them about housing forms, what kind of neighborhoods they want to live in, how this exercise actually is responsive to that population as well as the traditional single-family neighborhoods.
Thank you. Nobody, yeah. Yeah. So, if I could make one editorial comment, I think that civil engineers are the only ones that thought that those maps that you put up on the screen were pretty pictures.
You've drawn a few of those before.
Okay, well, Ali.
So, I was just going to ask, maybe it's premature, but what the next step is for us.
So the next step, as I said, we're going to meet with as staff first of the year. We're going to chart this out much more, and as necessary, we'll determine whether or not it'll be information that's presented to the Planning Commission, or if we come back as sort of a debrief. This is where we're headed, so it's not really, you know, this lengthy. It's not this much information, but really focused on certain parts. But you will know how we're proceeding in one way or another. You'll either be called on a subcommittee or, no, I'm kidding. There will be some information that's presented of how we'll proceed.
So we just leave it for now. We're not setting up subcommittees or talking about that kind of detail
Not necessarily at this point, but this is a public hearing, and we don't intend to keep the public hearing open. I mean, there will be, you know, constant communication, but the hearing would need to be closed because we don't have a date certain to when it would be continued.
Yeah.
Do we have specific meeting dates for January that have been confirmed?
Yes, we do, January 8th and January 15th.
8th and 15th. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.
We can move on. Is there any other business, old or new, for the commission?
I would just remind you that the next meeting is January 8th. So enjoy the holidays, rest up, because we're going to get pretty busy in the springtime. The January 8th agenda includes a review of the city's affordable housing demonstration ordinance. Everybody knows what that is, right? Yeah, I'm not sure either, but Kurt's here, and he can give us all the details if you want them. So that will be coming to you the first meeting in January, and then the second meeting in January on the schedule is amendments to the city's critical areas ordinance. Followed closely thereafter by review of 2 comprehensive plan / neighborhood plan amendments that were docketed. One in the Samish neighborhood across the street from the one you just looked at, and also one on Ashley Street. And then just to give you the sort of the bigger picture, in March, we have tentative dates for the beginning of the update to the ADU ordinance. So it's going to get pretty busy.
Okay.
Greg, do you see us as having meetings other than the first and third Thursdays then? I mean, I'm not talking about the subcommittees and that type of thing, but a meeting of the whole, do you see us going into those other Thursdays as well?
It's possible,
Okay.
depending on how much time you need to review the critical areas ordinance, for example. We'd like you to reserve every Thursday night from now until the end of time, but we know that's not reasonable. So as soon as if there are any changes to the schedule, added meetings, whatever, we'll let you know as soon as possible. And we understand that you have a life as well, so. Even though we have to be here.
Yes.
One last thing, if I may,
Yes.
Mr. Chairman. We met with, Rick and I met with Tom earlier this week to talk about a possible change to some of the procedure that you use for public hearings. This is something we've been sort of thinking about for a while, and we would like to propose it, and then you can tell us either, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, let's try it, or forget it, we don't want to do that. Or if you want to think about it over the holiday break, you can do that as well. So, standard public hearing format is presentation by staff, then presentation by an applicant if there is one, if it's not staff, and then the public comment period, public speaks, and then at some point the commission asks questions of staff or asks questions of the applicant, and so there's an exchange of information either between the commission and staff, as I said, or the commission and the applicant. But there isn't another opportunity for the public at that point to talk about what they heard or any issues that came up as a result of that discussion. So what we'd like to suggest, we try at least, is at the conclusion of the sort of question and answer session with staff or with the applicant, that we give the audience an opportunity to come up and correct any information that was put into the record that they think is incorrect, or just have a final opportunity to comment on the discussion that took place, the questions that were asked, and so forth. So we would do that right at the end before you close the public hearing.
Would there be time limits associated with that? I mean, is there?
You always have the opportunity to place time limits on. You want to make clear to people that you don't want a repeat of testimony that they've already given or other people's testimony. It's not another chance to sort of state your case. It's a chance to correct any misinformation that's in the record or information that someone believes is incorrect or not quite the whole story or whatever. So it's just another opportunity for the public to participate in the process and for you to have the benefit of that participation. So we'd like to give it a try. We'll do it in January at your first meeting. It'll be part of the script that the chairman has, so we don't forget. But if you're agreeable, we'd like to give that a try and see how it goes, see if it's useful to you or not.
Jeff?
I just had one question. There was some tension at a recent meeting over the segue from staff proponent presentations, then clarifying questions from the committee members to public comment. And there was a comment made that the public comment should come right after. There should be that public comment opportunity before the commissioners get too far into questions of staff. And I would just like to respond to that because I know we dealt with that issue. If we assume that the public is going to come and just give canned testimony based on what they may or may not have read in the mail, I could see doing that. If the commissioner questions actually clarify the proposal and may yield more insightful comments from the public, I think it's probably worth having that sequence where we go through the question process for clarifying, because if we're confused, the public might be confused. Actually have that exchange and allow that time for it, and then move into public comment, and then deliberate, and then I certainly wouldn't mind having an additional opportunity for the public to comment on what they heard. But I just feel it's important to not jump into public comment before we have a chance to. So I noticed that on the sequence. I don't know if I misread it or not, but I wanted to make sure that kind of stayed where it was so we don't have problems in the future with that.
No, that would stay the way it was. This would be simply to give the public an opportunity to correct a statement of fact or a misstatement of fact, they would not be able to get up and remake their case, and they wouldn't be able to drag in new information at the last minute. But if there was something that they thought was an egregious error or just an error, get up and state that,
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, if I was an applicant, I would certainly want to be afforded that opportunity.
We just need to be really careful about letting it spiral out of control. And
Time.
I think that
Time.
that burden would fall to a certain degree on you to make sure that people aren't getting up and rehashing things. And I don't personally want to have different members of the public have an argument amongst their opinions in front of us. So, there's a risk of this devolving into like a he said, she said thing. And a lot of what we're presented with is not fact. It's conjecture and opinion. So I'm all for it. I agree that more public opportunity for comment is important, but we need to make sure that we convey to the public before that starts exactly what it's for. And I saw the language that was proposed is very clear. So I'm all for it as long as we make it clear to everybody there's a specific purpose for that. It's not so you can argue about opinion. So that's just my 2 cents on it.
I would agree with everything that's been said, and I would also just second the time thing, because if it's not the same for every person, then it doesn't seem fair to me. So I think we need to find a way to, make sure everyone gets the same amount of time.
Okay, thank you. That was all I had.
Anything else for the good of the order? or
Yes,
not?
yes.
Yes,
I think Tom should be our chair next year.
too soon.
Yeah, we'll talk
We have
about
to-
that at your
We have
next
to
meeting
talk
in
about that
January.
next meeting.
I thought we were doing it now so that you could chair next meeting.
We'll assemble in this configuration, and if anything needs to change, we'll slide Tom out of there and slide in the next person. Yeah, be thinking about that, because we'll do it in January.